The sterile hum of the engines was a near-perfect white noise, a monotonous lullaby at 30,000 feet. For most passengers on Flight F-782 from New York to San Francisco, it was just another routine crossing. For Emily Carter, it was 5 hours of a fragile truce with reality. She sat in a window seat in row 24, economy class, having deliberately chosen a spot far from the bustle of the galleys. Asleep on her lap was 1-year-old Leo, his small chest rising and falling in rhythm with the plane's gentle vibrations. Emily looked the part of any young mother on a long journey. Comfortable jeans, a simple gray t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. No jewelry, save for a thin, plain wedding band. No makeup that could be smudged by fatigue or a stray toddler's hand. She was the picture of anonymity, one of hundreds of passengers dissolved into the drone and dimmed light of the cabin. This was exactly what she wanted. Flights were the one place she wasn't Mrs. Carter. She was just Emily, just a mom. Her gaze shifted from the whipped cream clouds outside to the flight attendant gliding down the aisle. A polished gold name tag on her impeccably tailored navy blue jacket read Jasmine. Jasmine Reed, senior flight attendant. She moved with the practiced grace of a predator on its own territory. Every gesture, from the way she placed a plastic cup on a tray table to the practiced curve of her lips that barely passed for a smile, broadcast absolute control. She was the queen here, and the aircraft cabin was her undisputed kingdom. The first hint of dissonance came when Leo woke with a start and began to fuss. It wasn't a full-blown scream, just a low, protesting whimper against the unfamiliar. Emily immediately began to soothe him, rocking him gently and whispering in his ear. At that moment, Jasmine's beverage cart drew level with their row. The senior flight attendant paused, and instead of offering help or simply moving on, she let out a loud, theatrical sigh. It was a sound designed to be heard 3 rows in either direction. She rolled her eyes, a gesture more eloquent than any word. "Oh, great," it said. "A baby." Emily felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. She pretended not to notice, focusing all her attention on her son. Within a minute, Leo was quiet again, distracted by a colorful toy. When Jasmine passed by again, Emily politely raised her hand. "Excuse me? Could I please have a glass of water for my son?" Jasmine didn't even break her stride. "As soon as I've completed the service," she called back over her shoulder. Her tone was dismissive, stripped of all courtesy. It was the cold, flat annoyance of a monarch bothered by a trivial peasant request. 20 minutes passed. The beverage cart was long gone. The water never came. Another, younger flight attendant, noticing Emily's expectant look, brought her a bottle with a sympathetic smile. The next time Jasmine patrolled the aisle on a seatbelt check, she glanced at Emily's tray table and spoke to no one in particular, yet loud enough for the whole section to hear. Some people think an economy ticket entitles them to first-class service. The audacity. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. The man in the adjacent seat suddenly found his laptop screen fascinating. A woman across the aisle shot Emily a look of pity. The air around row 24 grew thick and tense. Emily felt as though she'd been put in a public stockade for some minor, unspoken crime. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm. For Leo, the disaster, when it came, was small and sudden. Leo, playing with his toy, knocked over the small cup of apple juice Emily had been holding for him. Sticky liquid puddled on the tray table, a tiny amber flood trickling down to the floor. "Oh, honey, it's okay," Emily whispered, immediately grabbing baby wipes and starting to clean the mess. "I'm so sorry," she said, a little louder, hoping to catch the attention of any crew member. She caught Jasmine's. The senior flight attendant materialized beside her as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. Her face was a mask of righteous fury. "What is going on here?" Her voice sliced through the cabin's hum. Conversations ceased. Dozens of heads turned in their direction. "I'm sorry, my son just spilled his juice. I'm cleaning it up right now," Emily replied evenly, not looking up. "You're cleaning it up?" Jasmine sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "You've created a mess and a safety hazard on my aircraft. This is a complete lack of respect for the crew and for the other passengers. Do you have any control over your child at all?" The accusation was so disproportionate, so brutally public, that Emily froze. She lifted her head, her calm gray eyes meeting Jasmine's, which were blazing with anger. "It was an accident," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "And I apologized." It was that composure, that unshakable dignity, that seemed to be the final straw for Jasmine. In her eyes, she didn't see a flustered, apologetic mother. She saw a calm, collected white woman who refused to be cowed, who dared to maintain her poise in the face of Jasmine's authority. She was the embodiment of a quiet privilege that Jasmine found infuriating. "An accident," Jasmine hissed, leaning in close. "People like you need to be taught a lesson." And before anyone could process what was happening, her hand shot out. The sharp, ugly sound of a slap echoed through the cabin. It was followed by a silence so absolute, so profound, that even the engines seemed to have gone quiet. Leo, startled by the sudden violence, erupted into a piercing wail. A bright red mark began to bloom on Emily's cheek. She didn't cry out. She didn't gasp. She simply sat there, clutching her screaming child, her gaze locked on her assailant. At that moment, Jasmine Reed's entire kingdom, built on petty power and perceived authority, began to crumble. She just didn't know it yet. The ringing in Emily's ears was louder than her son's cries. The collective gasp of the passengers felt like a physical pressure, sucking the air out of the cabin. But through it all, a strange, chilling clarity descended upon her. The hot sting on her cheek was a distant fact, an entry in a report she was already composing in her mind. Her emotional response was locked away behind a steel door. What remained was pure, cold process. Her first priority was Leo. She pulled him tighter against her chest, rocking him with a steady, practiced motion. "Sure, baby, it's okay. Mommy's here. It's okay." Her voice was a low, soothing murmur that belied the violence of the moment. Jasmine Reed stood over them, her chest heaving, her eyes still alight with the thrill of her own dominance. She was expecting tears, a hysterical outburst, perhaps a futile threat to sue. She was prepared for any of those reactions. She was not prepared for the unnerving stillness that followed. Emily slowly raised her head. The red handprint on her pale skin was a stark accusation. Her eyes, however, held no fear and no anger. They were like chips of ice. She looked directly at the senior flight attendant, her gaze unwavering, and her voice, when she spoke, was perfectly level, almost unnervingly quiet. "Incident recorded." It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. The three words hung in the air, clinical and final. They were words of process, of documentation. They were the words of a system far larger and more powerful than Jasmine could comprehend. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Jasmine's face. The woman's reaction was wrong. It didn't fit the script. "You'd better believe it's recorded," Jasmine snapped, trying to regain control. Assaulting a flight crew is a federal offense. It was a desperate, clumsy lie, an attempt to twist reality, but the conviction in her voice had vanished. Emily didn't reply. She simply turned away, a subtle but complete dismissal. Her movement was deliberate. She shifted Leo to her other arm, reached into her diaper bag, and pulled out her phone. Her fingers were steady as she navigated the screen, her expression as calm as if she were checking the weather. Jasmine watched, a knot of confusion tightening in her stomach. What was she doing? Texting her husband to complain? Posting on social media? Jasmine scoffed internally. Let her. The company would stand by its senior staff, especially against a hysterical passenger. Emily tapped the icon for the in-flight Wi-Fi. The connection was sluggish, the small icon spinning for what felt like an eternity. To the other passengers, it looked like a woman trying to distract herself after a humiliating ordeal. But it was the most critical moment of the flight. Finally, the icon turned solid. She was connected. She opened a secure messaging app, one that required two-factor authentication. She selected a single contact from a heavily encrypted list, Mark Stone. She typed a short, precise message. There was no emotion, no explanation, just a string of code words that would set an irreversible chain of events into motion. To Mark Stone. Subject, in flight. Flight F, 782. Protocol red alert initiated. I am on site. Ensure reception on arrival. Full crew isolation. Her thumb hovered over the send button for a single heartbeat. Then she pressed it. The message disappeared from her screen, a silent signal fired from a pressurized tube in the sky to a command center on the ground. The gears of a vast, unforgiving machine had begun to turn. She put the phone away, gave Leo a reassuring kiss on the forehead, and leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes. From the outside, she looked like a victim, exhausted and defeated. Inside, she was anything but. She had initiated the protocol. Now, all she had to do was wait. Jasmine, meanwhile, had retreated to the galley, buoyed by a fresh wave of self-righteousness. She'd put the unruly passenger in her place. She had asserted her authority. A younger flight attendant, a girl named Maya, looked at her with wide, horrified eyes. Jasmine, you hit her. She was a threat to the safety and order of this cabin, Jasmine declared, her voice low and sharp. I handled it. Now get back to work. The rest of the flight passed in a strange, suspended tension. The passengers whispered among themselves, casting furtive glances toward row 24. A few offered Emily quiet words of support, which she accepted with a polite, distant nod. Jasmine Reed, for her part, patrolled the aisle with an extra swagger in her step, the conquering queen surveying her domain. She felt powerful, untouchable. She was blissfully unaware that a man named Mark Stone, the airline's notoriously ruthless head of global security, had already rerouted from his own meeting, personally dispatching a legal team and a specialized extraction unit to meet Flight F-782. He wasn't coming to discipline a passenger. He was coming to contain a corporate catastrophe. The familiar chime for final descent sounded through the cabin. Cabin crew, please prepare for landing. Jasmine Reed moved through the aisle with a renewed sense of purpose. She performed her final checks, her movements crisp and authoritative. In her mind, she was already composing the official report. Passenger Carter, Emily, row 24A, non-compliant and disruptive, created a disturbance, became verbally aggressive, required physical intervention to maintain order. The narrative was clean, professional, and painted her as a decisive leader maintaining safety and security. The slap would be framed as a necessary, defensive measure. She felt secure, protected by the corporate protocols she knew so well, or thought she knew. The landing was smooth. The aircraft touched down at San Francisco International, and the roar of the reverse thrusters filled the cabin. Passengers began to stir, gathering their belongings in the ritualistic pre-gate rush. But the plane didn't turn toward the terminal. It kept taxiing, moving past the brightly lit gates into a remote, desolate corner of the airfield reserved for cargo planes and de-icing procedures. It finally came to a stop beside a featureless hangar, far from the bustling life of the airport. A low murmur of confusion rippled through the passengers. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth but strained. Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to be experiencing a minor operational delay. Please remain in your seats until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. We appreciate your patience. Jasmine frowned. A remote stand was unusual for a domestic flight. It meant a delay, paperwork, and irritated passengers. Annoyance pricked at her. This was just another inconvenience caused by the woman in row 24. Then, she saw them. Through the cockpit window, a small convoy of black vehicles approached, moving across the tarmac with silent, purposeful speed. They were not the usual airport service vans or police cars. They were high-end SUVs, the kind used for diplomatic transport. They parked in a precise formation at the base of the aircraft. The jet bridge never came. Instead, a mobile staircase was rolled to the L1 door. At the bottom stood a half-dozen figures in dark, impeccably tailored suits. They stood motionless, their faces impassive, their eyes hidden behind sunglasses despite the evening gloom. They looked less like ground crew and more like a Secret Service detail. The seatbelt sign pinged off. As senior flight attendant, Jasmine moved to the door to supervise deplaning. She opened it, expecting to speak to a gate agent. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with a man in his late 50s with graying temples and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He didn't smile. He didn't greet her. His cold, analytical eyes swept past her, scanning the cabin as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture. His gaze settled on row 24. Ignoring Jasmine completely, the man walked down the aisle. The other suited figures followed, creating a silent, intimidating barrier that blocked the way for any other passenger. He stopped next to Emily's seat. The whole cabin watched, breathless. He leaned down slightly, and his voice, though quiet, was clear and carried an immense weight of authority. "Mrs. Carter, we're here. Are you and the young master unharmed?" The name hung in the air for a moment. Mrs. Carter. Jasmine's blood ran cold. Her mind, suddenly sluggish, scrambled to make a connection. Carter. It was an ordinary name. But in this airline, it was not. David Carter was the founder, the CEO, the near-mythical figure whose picture was in every company newsletter. The man who owned the entire airline. A wave of nausea washed over Jasmine. It couldn't be. This woman in her simple jeans and t-shirt, flying economy? It was impossible. It was a coincidence. But the man's deference was unmistakable. One of his team members stepped forward. "Ma'am, allow me to take your bags." Another gently helped her unbuckle Leo from her lap. They treated her not like a passenger, but like royalty. With Emily and Leo safely attended to, the man, Mark Stone, finally turned his attention to Jasmine. His eyes were devoid of all emotion. "Jasmine Reed," he said. "It was not a question. You and your entire crew are suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. You will surrender your company IDs and passports. You will not speak to each other. You will follow my associate to a secure location for a formal debriefing. This is not a request." Another associate, a severe-looking woman, stepped forward and held out her hand for Jasmine's ID. Her fingers trembled as she unclipped it from her jacket. The gold name tag that had been her shield and her scepter now felt like a mark of shame. Mark Stone then addressed the stunned passengers in the surrounding rows. His tone was now one of polite, corporate efficiency. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mark Stone, head of security. We apologize for this delay. Due to an unfortunate incident on board, we would be grateful if those of you in rows 22 through 26 would accompany us to provide a brief statement. As compensation for your time and inconvenience, the airline is offering each of you a $5,000 travel voucher or a direct payment of $2,000. Your choice." The offer was so outrageously generous, it was almost a threat. It ensured total cooperation. It turned every witness into a paid, willing participant in the company's internal tribunal. As Emily was escorted down the stairs and into the lead black SUV, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The system was in motion. Jasmine Reed and the rest of the flight crew were led down the same stairs, but in the opposite direction, toward a windowless van waiting in the shadows of the hangar. The short walk across the tarmac felt like miles. Just an hour ago, she had been the undisputed queen of a metal tube in the sky. Now, she was a disgraced employee, stripped of her authority and her future, about to discover the true meaning of turbulence. The secure facility was deep in the airport's administrative wing, a part of the terminal tourists and travelers never saw. It was a world of gray carpets, soundproofed walls, and an unnerving, sterile silence. The rooms were officially designated for sensitive HR debriefings, but their real purpose was corporate damage control. This is where careers came to die. Jasmine Reed sat in a small, windowless room at a metal table. Across from her sat Mark Stone and a woman from the airline's legal department, her face a mask of professional neutrality. A digital recorder lay between them. The air was cold, and Jasmine found herself shivering, though not from the temperature. "Let's begin with your official account of the incident involving passenger Carter," the lawyer said, her voice flat and devoid of inflection. Summoning the last vestiges of her bravado, Jasmine recited the version of events she had prepared in her mind. She painted Emily as an agitated, neglectful mother and herself as a calm professional, forced to take decisive action. The passenger became increasingly disruptive, Jasmine said, her voice sounding thin and reedy in the silent room. She refused to follow crew instructions regarding the cleanup of a biohazardous spill. "It was apple juice," Mark Stone interrupted, not looking up from the file in front of him. Jasmine faltered. "It was a sticky substance that could attract insects and compromise cabin hygiene. When I instructed her on the proper protocol, she became verbally abusive. I felt threatened. My action was a reflexive measure to ensure the safety of the cabin." The lawyer made a note, her expression unchanged. "So, you are stating for the record that you struck a passenger holding a 1-year-old child as a reflexive safety measure?" "Ah, yes. I felt I had no other choice." Mark Stone finally looked up. He slid a tablet across the table. On the screen was a video, shot on a passenger's phone from 2 rows back. The angle was clear. The audio was crisp. He pressed play. The video showed everything. Jasmine's condescending remarks. Emily's quiet, polite requests. The spill. And then, the slap. There was no verbal abuse from Emily. There was no threat. There was only a tired mother trying to manage her child, and a flight attendant escalating a minor incident into a violent confrontation. The video ended with the sharp, sickening sound of the slap, followed by the baby's terrified cry. Jasmine stared at the screen, her mouth dry. The foundation of her reality had just been pulverized. That's taken out of context, she stammered, but the words were hollow. We have 7 more videos just like it, Ms. Reed, Stone said, his voice dangerously soft. From 7 different passengers. We also have signed, sworn statements from 16 other passengers and 2 of your own crew members. Their accounts are remarkably consistent, and none of them match yours. He gestured to the lawyer, who opened a thick file. This brings us to your service record, the lawyer continued, her tone unchanged. In the past 5 years, 34 formal passenger complaints have been filed against you. Let me read you a few highlights. She began to read, her voice a relentless drone. August 2023. MS. Reed was rude and dismissive, publicly shaming a passenger for asking for a pillow. October 2023. The flight attendant, Jasmine, refused to assist an elderly passenger with his bag, stating it was not her job. January 2024. She made sarcastic comments about my crying child for the duration of the flight, creating a hostile and stressful environment. March 2024. MS. Reed deliberately ignored my call button for over an hour. The list went on and on. It was a stunning portrait of a long-term abuse of power, a pattern of bullying and intimidation. Each complaint was a voice from the past, a small cry for justice that had been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. Now, all those voices were being heard at once, amplified into a deafening chorus of condemnation. Why were none of these incidents followed up on? Stone asked, a rhetorical question. He already knew the answer. Jasmine was speechless. She had always considered these complaints minor annoyances, the whining of entitled passengers who didn't understand the pressures of her job. Her supervisor, a man named Paul Finch, had always laughed them off. Don't worry about it, Jazz, he'd say. I'll handle the paperwork. He had always protected her. Now, she realized he hadn't protected her at all. He had enabled her. He had built the pedestal she stood on, and now it was collapsing beneath her. Meanwhile, in a separate room, the young flight attendant, Maya, was giving her statement. She was terrified, but the sight of a senior executive like Mark Stone listening to her with focused intensity gave her courage. Jasmine, she's always been like that, Maya said, her voice trembling slightly. Especially with passengers she thinks are easy targets. Young women, non-native English speakers, people who look nervous or unsure. She has this contempt for them. We all see it. We're just too afraid to say anything. She's Paul Finch's favorite. Complaining about her is career suicide. The investigation was no longer about a slap. It was about a culture. Mark Stone's team worked through the night, cross-referencing flight rosters with passenger complaints, pulling personnel files, and tracing a web of negligence and cronyism. The single, violent act on Flight F-782 had ripped a hole in the fabric of the company, revealing a rot that had been festering for years. The voices that had been silenced were finally speaking, and their testimony was building a case that would ensure Jasmine Reed never worked in the airline industry again. Paul Finch, the operations manager for the in-flight services department, arrived at the airport with the breezy confidence of a man who believed himself to be untouchable. He had been called in for an urgent operational review, a term vague enough that he hadn't felt any particular alarm. He assumed a passenger had filed a complaint, as they often did, and that he would be called upon to smooth things over, file a report, and protect his staff. Protecting his staff, especially Jasmine Reed, was Paul's specialty. Their relationship was a classic case of mutually beneficial cronyism. Jasmine was an aggressive enforcer of his standards on board, a senior attendant who kept the younger crew in line. In return, Paul made her problems disappear. Complaints vanished into a bureaucratic black hole. Negative performance reviews were softened or lost. He had built a fortress of paperwork and procedure around his favorite employees, creating a fiefdom within the corporate structure where his authority was absolute. He walked into the designated conference room, expecting to see a mid-level HR manager. Instead, he found Mark Stone, the company's head of global security, and two stone-faced lawyers from the corporate legal team. The air in the room was frigid. "Paul, thanks for coming in," Stone said, without a trace of warmth. He gestured to the empty chair. It felt less like an invitation and more like an order. "Mark, what's all this about?" Paul asked, trying to keep his tone light. "One of the girls get a feisty passenger?" "You could say that," Stone replied, his eyes like chips of flint. He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished table. "This is a log of 34 passenger complaints filed against senior flight attendant Jasmine Reed over the past 5 years. Standard procedure dictates that any complaint involving accusations of verbal abuse or harassment triggers an automatic internal review. For senior crew, that review is to be escalated to your desk. Can you show me the reports for these 34 reviews?" Paul felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. "Well, Mark, you know how it is. We get hundreds of these things. 99% are frivolous. People upset about a lack of peanuts or a bumpy landing. We investigate, of course, but you can't take every single one." "I'm not asking about the hundreds of frivolous complaints, Paul," Stone cut in, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "I'm asking about these 34 specific, documented cases against one employee. I am asking for the paperwork, for the records of interviews, for the disciplinary action reports. Because my team has been in the archives for the past 8 hours, and they can't seem to find any. It's almost as if they never existed." The legalistic trap snapped shut. Paul's carefully constructed fortress was being dismantled, brick by brick. His primary defense, that he had followed procedure, was being exposed as a complete fabrication. He had not followed procedure. He had systematically and deliberately ignored it. "I handle these things internally, on a case-by-case basis," Paul stammered, his confidence evaporating. A quiet word with the employee is often more effective than a formal write-up. "A quiet word," the female lawyer echoed, her voice laced with ice. "So when a passenger complaint states that Ms. Reed referred to a family as trailer trash loud enough for other passengers to hear, your response was a quiet word. When another passenger alleged that Ms. Reed refused to help her stow a medical device, leading to it being damaged during takeoff, that also warranted a quiet word," the second lawyer chimed in. "And when a junior flight attendant filed an internal report stating that she witnessed Ms. Reed mocking a passenger's accent, you buried it so thoroughly that the attendant who filed it was transferred to the red-eye Newark to Cleveland route a week later." Mark Stone finished, his voice a hammer blow. They knew everything. They had not only collected the passenger complaints, they had started contacting the complainants. They had interviewed other flight attendants who had been afraid to speak up for years. The single case of a slap on Flight F-782 had metastasized into a full-blown investigation into systemic corruption, negligence, and the creation of a toxic and legally liable work environment. Paul Finch was no longer being questioned about Jasmine Reed. He was being investigated for gross misconduct and a deliberate cover-up. His entire department, his nest of cronyism and negligence, was being exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of a corporate legal audit. "You didn't just ignore these complaints, Paul," Stone said, leaning forward. "You actively suppressed them. You fostered a culture of impunity. You allowed a bully to operate under the protection of your authority. Every single one of these 34 incidents was a potential lawsuit, a potential PR disaster. You didn't protect your employee, Paul. You exposed this entire company to catastrophic risk." Stone stood up, the signal that the interview was over. "Your access to all company systems has been revoked. You'll be escorted from the premises. Don't bother clearing out your desk. We'll do that for you." As two security guards entered the room, Paul Finch finally understood. He hadn't been called in for a review. He had been summoned for an execution. The system of mutual protection he had built with Jasmine had become a suicide pact, and the bill had just come due. The Emergency Disciplinary Council was not held in a courtroom, but it possessed all the gravity of one. It took place in the airline's opulent, top-floor boardroom, a space normally reserved for shareholder meetings and celebrating record profits. Today, its atmosphere was funereal. Jasmine Reed and Paul Finch sat on one side of a vast mahogany table. They looked small and defeated, stripped of the uniforms and titles that had once given them power. Across from them sat Mark Stone, the legal team, and the vice president of human resources. The jury, judge, and executioner all rolled into one. At the head of the table, a massive 8K screen flickered to life. It showed a single, unadorned office, a stark contrast to the boardroom's luxury. A man sat behind the desk, his presence commanding the screen despite the distance. It was David Carter. His expression was calm, almost unnervingly so. He was not there as Emily's husband. His posture and the cold, assessing look in his eyes made it clear he was there as the founder and ultimate authority of the company he had built from nothing. Let the record show this is a formal disciplinary hearing for senior flight attendant Jasmine Reed and operations manager Paul Finch. The lead counsel began, his voice echoing in the silent room. He then spent 10 minutes methodically summarizing the findings. The physical assault on Emily Carter, substantiated by video evidence and 17 witness statements, the 34 prior complaints against Ms. Reed, and the deliberate, systemic suppression of those complaints by Mr. Finch. It was a brutal, meticulous dissection of their careers. When it was her turn to speak, Jasmine tried to salvage what was left of her dignity. She attempted to deploy the language of therapy and victimhood that had become so common in public apologies. "I take full responsibility for my actions," she began, her voice quivering. "But I need you to understand the pressure we are under. The stress, the constant demands. That day, I was not myself. I felt threatened by the passengers' hostility, and I reacted poorly. I believe my actions, while wrong, were a result of a toxic and stressful work environment. And frankly, I feel I am being judged more harshly because of who I am." She left the final phrase hanging in the air, a veiled insinuation of racial bias. On the screen, David Carter's expression did not change. He let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment before he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it filled the room with an absolute, unshakable authority. "Ms. Reed, I don't care about your feelings. I care about my passengers. I care about my company. I started this airline with 2 leased planes and a simple promise. We will get you to your destination safely, and we will treat you with respect. Not because it's good for business, but because it is the baseline of human decency." He looked directly at her through the camera, and for the first time, Jasmine felt a true sense of dread. "You didn't just have a bad day," he continued, his voice cold and precise. "You have had a bad 5 years. You have systematically bullied the people who pay your salary. You believe your uniform gives you power. It doesn't. It gives you a responsibility, one you have repeatedly and grotesquely abused. Your final act was to physically assault a woman holding her child because you couldn't handle a spilled cup of juice. There is no excuse. There is no context in which that is acceptable." He then turned his attention to Paul Finch, who seemed to shrink in his chair. "And you, Mr. Finch, you were the gatekeeper. You were entrusted to uphold our standards. Instead, you built a system that protected bullies and punished victims. You are the source of the rot. Your negligence is, in many ways, more damaging than her violence." The verdict was delivered without ceremony. "Jasmine Reed, your employment is terminated, effective immediately, for gross misconduct. A lifetime ban will be placed on your record for any future employment within the aviation industry. All materials from our investigation, including the videos of your assault, will be turned over to the district attorney's office. This company will recommend the prosecution pursue criminal charges to the fullest extent of the law. Paul Finch, your employment is terminated, effective immediately, for gross negligence and willful suppression of safety and conduct reports. Our legal team will be assessing the full financial liability your actions have exposed this company to. You can expect to hear from them." It was over. 2 careers, built on a foundation of arrogance and corruption, had been utterly demolished in under 30 minutes. Weeks later, the news of the firings and the subsequent criminal charges against Jasmine Reed had become a cautionary tale within the industry. But for David and Emily Carter, the goal had never been mere punishment. In his office, David signed the directive that would make the incident on Flight F-782 a catalyst for permanent change. The new program was called Clear Sky. It established a fully independent ethics and conduct committee, with oversight powers that bypassed the traditional departmental hierarchy and reported directly to the CEO's office. It implemented a new, transparent system for tracking passenger and employee complaints, where every entry was logged, tracked, and could not be deleted without a formal, multi-level review. Finally, it mandated comprehensive de-escalation and customer respect training for all 10,000 employees, starting from the top down. Emily had refused any personal financial settlement from the airline. Her only demand had been for systemic change. Her insistence was the moral engine behind the Clear Sky Protocol. That evening, Emily, David, and a now playful Leo stood on the balcony of their home, which overlooked the bay. In the distance, the lights of an airplane blinked as it ascended into the darkening sky, a clean, white machine against a canvas of deep blue. It was one of their fleet. Emily wasn't watching the plane. She was watching her son, who was giggling as his father lifted him high into the air, pretending he was an airplane. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of victory. There was only a quiet, profound sense of satisfaction. A system had been corrupted by one person's prejudice and another's negligence. A protocol had been activated. The corruption had been purged. The system had been fortified. Justice hadn't come in the form of a satisfying, vengeful blow. It had come as a quiet, methodical recalibration, ensuring that the skies would be a little safer and a little more civil for every passenger who came after her. The balance had been restored.